The 1949 Act and the structure of the Physiotherapy Board was very awkward. The registrar was a member of the board. The chairman of the board was somebody from the Department of Health. Heads of school were on the board. There were two medical specialists, one of whom was usually an orthopaedic surgeon because of the links with physiotherapy. And one we've had a neurologist, I think, at one time, and so on. And then there were 3 physiotherapists nominated to the minister by the society. I think that was how it went. I'd have to have the act in front of me to remember in exact detail. They were appointed by the minister, except some of us were on as of right, like my role and the chairman's role and the heads of school's role were there as of right. The heads of school had problems with going back to their schools because I think the staff probably felt that the heads of school were their representatives on the board, and what they wanted to get through was, the heads of school should push it. Whereas in fact, if you look at the Act, and it's probably, over time I've learned a lot about governance and the difference between governance and administration, been involved in a lot of those sessions with other boards I've been on, that in fact when they're on the board, they're there to make particular decisions which were set out in the functions of the board, and that they could put a point of view, there's no question about that. But in fact they then had to abide, they might be outvoted on the board, but they had to abide by the board decision. And this they found sometimes very hard to take, and would go back to their schools, or one particular school featured in my mind more than another. And then I presume the staff would attack the head of school, say, why did you let this go through? Why did you allow this to happen? And we used to say, well, you just hide behind the board. The board say she was outvoted, and it was discussed widely, and the board made a decision after all these things, and that was that. They just had to abide by it. But it would start off a flurry sometimes of correspondence, which made it a bit difficult. And I think it made it tough, really on the staff probably in some instances too, that they felt they had this. And of course, the medical specialists really had no idea of what physiotherapy training and what all this sort of thing was about. So they tended to go with the flow a bit. And we really needed more physios, more independent thinkers, less people tagged to particular. The society felt they had sort of representatives, you might say, on the board, whereas they weren't, they were nominees, in fact, if they looked at the Act. And they just had the right to make nominations. And it's not what you would have called an ideal board, and we struggled with that. There was a long, long time before that legislation got changed. It got fiddled with and twiddled with at different times. And in 1992 or thereabouts, the registrar became not the advisory physiotherapist. I'd never had any problems with that. I just felt you can get professional advice, you can get physiotherapy advice when you want it. And you really wanted was a good administrator, a good manager and a good administrator to make sure that you follow the legislation, because you have to follow the legislation or you'd end up in court. Disciplinary procedures and doing hearings and so on. You had to be very particular that the correct processes were used, but you didn't need a physiotherapist, a person with a physiotherapy background to do that. I didn't have a problem with a non-physiotherapist being the registrar, provided all the processes in the board worked in a functional way, and the board was the overarching. We had actually governance people come and talk to the board one time, the expert guy from Boardworks International, to try and get the board to start thinking about acting as a board and not as being part of the administration system, basically, I suppose you'd say. And that's, of course, happens quite a lot even today out in companies and industry, where the board members start to try and interfere in the management processes. But so it wasn't an ideal structure in a way if you were looking at structure of a board for that particular role. But we were stuck, and it was to use the current quote expression, non-sexy topic for governments to introduce legislative change for. So we were struggling along under a very old piece of legislation.